least, game over. And so I think for that, the Saints have every right to feel screwed, disappointed, shocked, hurt. Any of those adjectives you want to throw in, I think are fair. It is probably the most egregious no call in sports history. And so I do think for that reason, the Saints, New Orleans, because of our, connection to the team and even people in the NFL have every right to raise a ruckus, which you've seen over the last few days. So I did want to also talk about just some of the angles after the events of Sunday afternoon. So on Tuesday, the aforementioned Roby Coleman, who I feel like that name is going to become a pretty big deal and just Saints history, just because of the connection to that play and to the Saints not making a Super Bowl. Anyway, he went on Facebook, I believe it was, and bragged about whipping Lewis's ass. And like I said, all in all, it seems like the Rams have been hardly apologetic about the way they won. And combined with, fans feeling cheated by the overtime rules and the way the AFC Championship game ended with Pat Mahomes never even touching the ball. One of the consequences of that have been ticket prices for the Super Bowl are just plummeting to an, almost, maybe not all-time low, obviously. I mean, considering inflation and all that, but probably proportionately, they may be an all-time low. And, I think a lot of people, myself included, are expecting, all-time low TV ratings for the game. I don't think this worked out for Atlanta. I think they already were probably dreading the Patriots. And then you have the Rams and the way they won. And it's not the ideal situation for the NFL. I mean, I don't think it could turn out for them, but again, because it seems to always turn out for the NFL, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later too. But this whole situation, circumstance, whatever, just reeks of just typical NFL. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit. But I think part of the reason, you think about New Orleans and generally it tunes into the big NFL events, whether it's the Super Bowl, whether it's draft, whether it's just primetime games, even games that don't involve the Saints. They seem to, New Orleanians seem to watch more than any other fan base. And so when, the Saints get screwed out of the Super Bowl the way they were, yeah, it makes sense. I'm sure there will be a few households throughout New Orleans that are still tuned into the game, but we know already several New Orleans area bars are planning for anti-Super Bowl parties. Some will be showing the Super Bowl from 2010, Super Bowl 44, that the Saints, of course, won. We know that a group has organized, or at least tried to. I haven't seen if there's been any traction or movement on this, but tried to organize a concert to take place at the same time the Super Bowl game is being played, with proceeds slated to go to local music and sports charities, at least last I heard. And I want to say it was it was the Boycott Bowl, I believe is what they were calling it, but for a concert. I thought that was a really cool idea, and would, put some money in the right places and go to a good cause. That would be awesome if that comes together. And if it does, for those of you who can make it, I would encourage you to go out and do that. Also, there's been the proposal of having a parade for the Saints during the game. I'm not as as wild about that idea. I think a parade for the Saints is a great idea. I don't know about during the game. I would think maybe just have them, maybe have a parade specifically during Mardi Gras, maybe add something. But I don't know. I'm far from the expert on that, and I realize that could create its own logistical issues. But I mean, I like the idea overall. I just don't know about during the Super Bowl. But if that parade were to happen, I think we could call it something like "We Are the Real Champions" parade. And I don't think it would be beyond our rights to play the Queen, "We Are the Champions" song. But at the same time, I will admit that a lot of that feels kind of desperate and maybe pathetic, you might say, or at least some would say that. Kind of like UCF claiming the national championship in 2017. And yet, to be completely honest, and maybe this doesn't sit right with some, but as an SEC person, but I actually supported that. And the Saints have a better claim than UCF did. So there's those angles. Some other angles. Saints fans and New Orleans-based organizations. You've probably seen pictures, if not the billboards themselves. Some, I believe, in New Orleans and the surrounding area. Some in Atlanta, pointing out really the obvious, namely that the refs BLEUX or blew it. And, of course, that Goodell is an idiot, which I feel like is an appropriate billboard to have up anytime. And there were a few others with similar messages, but those were probably the two most pertinent, or the two that stood out the most. And yeah, I mean, Goodell is an idiot. Everyone, I think, knows that. And yet, yeah, I'll just leave it at that for the moment. Shirts have been made. I think I have one coming on the way. I think it's Refed It Up, or I don't know. I can't remember what shirt I got, but I got one coming on the way. I'll be wearing for quite a while. Cookies with with head referee Bill Vinovich's face crossed over, created by Haydell's Bakery. That's a nice touch, don't you think? And then probably most notably, multiple lawsuits have already been filed against the NFL and the officials for loss. I can't remember exactly how it was worded, but something like loss of enjoyment or almost like PTSD. And I think most people would recognize that those lawsuits aren't going to actually change anything, but they're mostly symbolic, and I think everyone agrees or understands that. Hopefully, the NFL clearly isn't going to do anything. It looks like even their, the rule that you probably saw tweeted out or Instagrammed out or both, I don't know, by Michael Thomas about the commissioner having the power to change things. Apparently, there's also a stipulation that basically it'd have to be like a natural disaster or something like that, which I don't know. It's an interesting rule. At first, I was kind of thinking, oh, so this is like in baseball where you can play a game under protest, and apparently it's not quite that. But whatever. The point of that is, lawsuits are there. I think mostly symbolically. Nothing's going to change, unfortunately. It's, there will not be justice for the Saints organization, for the city of New Orleans for this. Which and I'm going to point to something else Mike Lombardi brought up, but he also brought up in that podcast just the enormous economic um, um, shifts or economic just change that brings. I mean, certainly, I mean, obviously for the players and coaches, I mean, they had the chance to, to make some significant cash, but even just the region in New Orleans, there was a chance to probably bring in, you know, hundreds of millions, if not even, billion more dollars in revenue to the city just for having, you know, a Super Bowl appearance and potential Super Bowl championship. Certainly would have brought in more revenue to the city and the surrounding area. And so it's amazing how much a blown call like that actually does matter, and not just a football game, but um, you know even economically and financially to a region, which of course the Gulf Coast and New Orleans. I mean, it can always benefit from more economic boosts. So um, that is actually a serious issue, and is another reason to just be sick about it. So, um, despite all that, and you would think that just rings like, okay, NFL, you have to do something. Um, and I usually am not the type to rail on, certainly on officials, or even to take anything other than what you might say would be the quote unquote high road. In this case, I don't think any of these things, whether it's billboards, cookies, or lawsuits even, I don't think they're going too far. Because something, and this is what, Saints owner Gail Benson and even Governor John Edwards were asking, like, we understand you probably can't change it for us, but no team should ever have to suffer this kind of loss again. Like, you have to make things right going forward. And yet, notable NFL salary cap and business analyst, I think that's a good title for him. Andrew Brandt, who's been on, I believe, ESPN and maybe even NFL Network. He formerly worked for the Packers, I know. He said that despite the absolute necessity for this play, and this is not a direct quote, I'm paraphrasing him, the absolute necessity for this play to result in rule changes, most notably of which would be making pass interference a reviewable play, that it's unlikely to happen, that there's too many logistics, and that it doesn't fit the way the NFL works. As a Saints fan, as someone who just wants fairness in the way games are officiated, you have to ask why. And honestly, I would say because the NFL's dumb. It doesn't care about its integrity. It cares more about press. Because remember, all press is good press. It's an old idiom or an old phrase, and yet it rings true even in 2019. Because you think about it, despite their utter mishandlings of the Kaepernick / national anthem saga, if you want to call it that, and the countless number of domestic violence cases, which were somehow handled even worse, people still tune into the NFL. It's still one of the most heavily watched television programs or programming throughout the fall. And like I said, despite, Gail Benson and the governor and all of them making really good cases, this still just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Lombardi, who I already talked about, pointed out on that podcast that both in college football, so NCAA, and the CFL, which, happen to be the two other major North American football leagues, this play automatically gets overturned because they have rules in place to make sure of it. In college, you would get an automatic